Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I am Deb Philman, your host, and we have got a great show for you today about classical education. Before I get started, though, if you are new to the channel, please consider subscribing if you are interested in all things
Mhm.
related to education in America. And go ahead and smash that like button right now and share this broadcast with others who might be interested in the topic. This applies to anyone who is currently looking to make a switch to possibly a classical academy or who is even looking to homeschool and follow the classical method. If you've ever heard about classical education and you want to know more, this is a show for you. So please get the word out before we get started. Today's guest is an expert on this subject who I have with me, Oscar. Now, I'm going to probably mess it up. Ortiz Duarte. Did I say it correctly?
That's perfect. Oscar
Okay,
Ortiz.
wonderful. He is the CEO and superintendent of Heritage Classical Academy in Houston, Texas. He has devoted his entire career to classical education and over the course of 10 years has gone from the classroom to head of school to CEO and superintendent. And he is known for being a passionate advocate for various charter programs, classical charter programs, and lending his
Mhm.
assistance and expertise to all. He has an undergraduate degree in philosophy, a master's in the liberal arts, and he is well versed in classical themes. So he brings all of that to us today. Originally from Honduras, your
Mhm.
vocation has always been creating access to classical education, especially to diverse and disadvantaged populations, believing that the true, the good, and the beautiful paves the way for all to lead flourishing lives. I could not agree more. But I'm not going to editorialize. I'm going to leave it to you to talk about it. But welcome. Thank you so much for being here, especially during this week. It's school choice week, everyone.
Yes,
Yay.
yes. Thank you so much, Deb. I really appreciate you inviting me to be part of your program, especially now, as you pointed out. Parents are seriously considering and weighing their options and
Mhm.
considering alternatives to the traditional public school education. So this is the timing couldn't have been better. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. But you know what's so funny? You just said alternatives to the traditional public school education. And what I find
Mhm.
so hilarious is that classical education is actually traditional education that,
Yes, I mean,
like our founders, et cetera. And what we have now is progressive,
mhm, mhm.
the antithesis of tradition, right?
So the reason I use that word purposefully actually because I want our parents to hear that classical education is countercultural. I mean, what we have now, what has become kind of the cultural norm, is what I would consider traditional. And what we've seen, I mean, anyone who looks at the statistics, who does research and look at how our students are performing, it's failing our children. So
Yes.
that's why I want to present to our families something new, something exciting, something that yes has been done for several thousands of years,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean it's being done the same way that it was done 1,000 years ago. So with
No.
all of our technology and everything that we know about child psychology, classical education is always shaping itself and making itself more relevant. I would say that some of the traditional forms of education that we see happening today.
Yeah.
But I'm biased, so I'm gonna admit
I
that from the start. I
no,
love
I
classical, yeah.
agree with you. I think that's a great way to frame it as countercultural. And we've
Mhm.
seen some trends recently do that, where used to be if you were planting your own garden or, sort of raising your own food, whatever that would be, like people might call you a prepper. Now it's considered homesteading and it's all trendy and
That's
wonderful.
right. Mhm.
So, but because it's been modernized, right? We now have the best of both worlds. We know what works, and yet we can
Mhm.
apply modern humane technology and things like that. Well, talk to us though about you were just talking about offering something better, offering something new and exciting and different. Talk about that. Why is classical that thing, that better thing?
Well, classical does a couple of things that I think will address some of the issues that we're seeing today in our society, and it addresses these head on. It's not we don't apologize for it. We don't try to. Again, any parent who wants to do classical and is looking at a classical school will see that we're transparent. They can look at our curriculum, they can look at the books that we're studying, and they can find in them that in terms of diversity, We are the most diverse that you can find out there in terms of diversity of thought. We are the most diverse that you can find out there in terms of our commitment to the pursuit of truth. We just don't apologize for those things, and I think that's a just a what is it a gush of fresh air, if you will, for a lot of our families who currently are wondering whether they can trust their academic institutions. And this is not happening just at the K-12 level. It's happening all the way up to college and, your postdoctoral. Parents are wondering, do I really want to pay, $30 to $50,000 a year to have my child go to a school? Well, all that's happening is what seems to be indoctrination.
Mhm.
Now, I don't want to just do a blanket statement and say it's happening everywhere, but
Mhm.
it's certainly in the media right now. Everyone's talking about it, and it's encouraging to see that our families are now starting to ask the question: Is this
Mhm.
school really doing the things that it's setting itself out to do? And
Right.
classical does that. Classical really focuses on human nature. So, what the things that make us, um, the things that we share in common as humans, and for that reason, I believe it's also a unifier. So it unites children and it teaches them to see the things that we all have because of what we are, not who we are. So who we are is really what sets us apart, right? So I'm from Honduras, as he pointed out. I'm a Latino. I was born and raised in Honduras all my life. I've been here for 20 years now. And by the way, Deb, I just want to say I love the American culture, the principles, everything that you guys stand for. And I'd love to talk more about that here in just a second. But
Sure.
who we are is what sets us apart, right? It makes
Mhm.
me an individual. But what we are, that's what a classical education aims to try to uh, explore with children. And what we are is really what unites us.
Mhm.
The fears that we have in common, the desires that we share in common, I mean, there's just a slew of things that we can go through here. So I'll let you direct this conversation in whichever
No,
direction.
I mean, I could just keep listening because it is a breath of fresh air. We've been hearing so much about the need to point out differences and highlight differences. And as a person who um had a more traditional, well, I won't say traditional like how you describe, but a more classical education myself. It wasn't literally in the classical sense, but much more classical than what kids have today. That has struck me as so strange. I just keep looking and say, "What? Why would you do this?" Like, it doesn't make sense to me, and I'm a person who likes things to make sense. And like you said, I think of, what we're supposed to teach children is how to pursue the truth,
Mhm.
how to learn about the world in which they live, how to observe it, how to function in it, and how to understand what it means to be human in that world because we are
Mhm.
humans. We're not something else, right?
That's right.
And so, you know, it's philosophically different, isn't it? It's not just that I mean, explain that a little bit. How would you compare and contrast the philosophy behind classical education and the philosophy behind what we see in today's public school institutions or even private schools?
Yes. So what we do differently is we give. So what Charlotte Mason, which is one of there are many, and I hope to expose all of our listeners to a lot of philosophers of classical education today, and they
Mhm.
don't all agree with each other. So this is also very important. One of the main attacks against classical, which is a false one, it's a what I call straw man fallacy, is that it's this monolithic. One type thing regarding philosophy, regarding politics, regarding religion. It's actually quite the opposite. It is 2,000 years of humans disagreeing with each other and to the point of becoming somewhat belligerent. Some of the stories I love to tell our students some of the stories of bishops or philosophers, poets, artists who just disliked each other so much that they would even have physical altercations sometimes. There's a bishop I can think of who broke another bishop's nose because there was such a strong disagreement between them. So, this is what the classical is. It's not a monolithic, one worldview type thing. It's all these voices, all these cultures, all these different languages and time periods trying to address the same questions. So, right there, you could see that we are exposing our children to what Charlotte Mason says is a feast. The classical education model is to expose
Mhm.
our children to a buffet of just an amazing array of ideas cultures, and languages. So already our students they can see themselves, first of all, in some of these characters, historical characters, but they can also find themselves in the fact that they were also human. They also felt the same passions or angers or love or sense of duty towards their communities. And in this way, which is what's so beautiful about classical, is our students understand I'm in a time and place. I also belong to a community. There are those who look like me and there are those who don't look like me. However, we can all come together over the things that we have in common. So it's a very relevant form of education for that reason, because we're all together as a community, not as disparate or separate, right, political units or identities, but as humans trying to answer the question about justice, for example. What is justice for us today?
Mm-hmm.
And can we draw meaning from the men and women who thought about these questions 2,000 years ago,
Right.
sometimes even just 50 years ago, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's another misunderstanding about classical. And Deb, please cut me off because I can just
No,
wax
no, 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 no,
philosophical for
no, no.
hours.
I'm listening. I'm thinking of things as you're talking,
I'm
but
sorry.
keep going.
Another attack against classical, which I think is, again, a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means or what it stands for, is that it's all ancient texts. And I think that the confusion comes from the fact that at the college level, you do have something called the classics
The
department, and
classics,
you
right?
major in the classics, and that's primarily going to be texts in the Greek and Roman tradition.
Right.
At the K-12 level, right, that's not what we're doing. We do take kind of our direction from there, but
Mm-hmm.
at the K-12 level, we consider classics all of those books, all of the works of art, all of the poems, all of the music that participates in the conversation that started in the Greek and Roman texts. So we have some classics that are just 50 years, 50 years ago. I can think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches, for
Sure.
example. Those are
Mm-hmm.
considered classics. Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, those are now considered classics. Uh, I got into a discussion with someone on Twitter just a few days ago regarding Moby Dick. In his time, Moby Dick was controversial and it was not considered a classic. Today
No.
it is, and it is a required reading at our school. So the
Right.
classics are constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in a way, it's the most democratic approach to education that there can be, for the
Mm-hmm.
reason that it's always fashioning itself based on what the majority of people who read these books, how they just love these books and it speaks to them. So,
Right. So it's more like classical themes
mhm.
rather than it's old.
Correct, correct. There
Something
are
that
gonna be
stands
some
the test of time. Yeah, some are old, but they stand the test of time because they teach us something about the human condition
mhm,
that is, eternal. I mean, it's not really going to change, like you said, about human nature, the human condition, what we are as humans. And we can certainly get that out of very old literature. We can get it out of very new literature. The only thing we have to look at, though, is we have to look for those unifying themes, right?
yes. I
Um,
I do wanna add just one element of, artistry because this is important.
yes,
It is the best that has been produced, and
correct.
that's significant because we're not just taking any text and calling it a classic. We're looking at those texts that exemplify the best at their time and their field. So when
Yeah.
I read Frederick Douglass's speeches, for example, I'm looking at the best of what has come in the tradition of oratory or
Mhm.
rhetoric. And in many ways, Frederick Douglass, um, he's so sublime. I mean, he is just transcends what. And I teach rhetoric,
Right.
by the way. I should just say that I've taught rhetoric, classical rhetoric for a while. He transcends a lot of the just. I would say, because he's one of my favorites, 99% of all of the classics before him. He's just incredible. Now, how does he do that? Well, he himself received or was exposed to the classics and he absorbed it into himself and then made something new with it. And that's how we see the birth of new classics coming into being. And the classics, for that reason, it's just there's never going to be a stop as
Mhm.
long as we have liberty. And this is important. As
Right.
soon as we're not free to think, then that's when we're going to see the decline of the classics, decline of thinking, and ultimately we're going to enter a state in which we are demanded. There's going to be an academic tyranny where we're going to be demanded to think in one way, and that's really the end of it, right? So we pray and hope that that doesn't happen.
Right. Do you feel like that
Hmm.
is happening in some areas, that there are people pushing for that, and that that is kind of what we're facing in terms of the, let's say, like the public system in America, as far as the prevailing pedagogy?
This is such a great question. It's great because it's really going to draw us into the classics. And one thing I want to do while I'm talking about this, Deb, is I want to exemplify in myself how the classics can really transform the imagination of a child.
Mhm.
Just a little bit of background. As you said, I'm from Honduras. I was born and raised there. I started my education in the classics really late. I was 21, 22 years old when I first heard of Aristotle. It's like, wow, I had no idea who he was. And he spoke to me as a Hispanic man. He spoke to
Interesting.
me in a way where I realized and I knew this is for me, right? It's not this, it belongs to an elite class of people that look a certain way or speak a certain way. He was speaking to me, and that was just transformative. So that's the first thing. So
Mhm.
for any of our listeners who feel like, oh my gosh, I didn't have a classical education, I'm coming real late into this whole thing, I want to encourage them. It's never too late. Think of my example. Now think of somebody else's example that just comes to mind right now. I was just reading recently about Churchill. Churchill himself says that he came late to the classics. He was in his 20s, just as like I was. And
Mhm.
that's when the classics really spoke to him, and it transformed his life. He would even claim that this is when his education started. So again, it's never too late to pick up the classics and begin a conversation with people who lived 2,000 years ago. But to address your question, let's go to that point. This is important. um, I love to point out to my students that what we call cancel culture today, for example, and we
Mhm.
see a prevalence of people wanting to um, just squash opposition in our day. I like to point out to them that this isn't new. This is
Right.
this isn't new. So
Mhm.
Hesiod, in his in his book Works and Days, or his poem Works and Days, this is 2,000, 2,300 years ago. He gives us the ages of man, and he goes through 5 ages of man, and he just show how progressively we become just worse. We start in an idyllic society, all happy, living among the gods, and then progressively we just become more corrupt and corrupt and corrupt. And there's this idea of a cycle where it just happens over and over again. We see in Polybius his cycles, right? He talks about we start with an aristocracy or a monarchy, and then from there we go on to he goes through every political regime that you can think of, and then
Mhm.
right before you enter tyranny, this is important. Right before you enter tyranny, you have a democracy. So democracy seems to be, and our founding fathers understood this, democracy has these vices, as some of our founding fathers would say in the Federalist Papers, already in them. It's part of the
Mhm.
nature of democracy that
Yeah.
it will lead to a tyranny if it's not kept under check. So to encourage my students, I tell them, don't be discouraged by what you're seeing. It's a sign that we really need to be vigilant, and we need to speak the truth and seek the truth always, and not give up, because liberty is
Mm.
not something that is given to us by the state. It can be taken. So
Yeah.
we need to be,
We
uh,
know that.
liberty is something that we need to continue working on and maintaining ourselves. So
Right.
I'm seeing some trends. I haven't seen them as bad as they are right now. But then again, you look at history, and this is why it's so important. It's happened before. Book
Right.
burnings have happened before. Burning at the stake has happened before.
Right.
Socrates was, he was killed by
Right.
his state for his thinking.
Right.
So the classics are essential in helping students, giving children kind of a broad view of
Mhm.
our human history, and deepening their understanding of those things, and um, almost there's a light of hope at the end as a result. And it's one of the things that I don't see happening in our modern education. I see our
Right.
children being completely, there's this, what I call an insular education, where they're being put, there's these blinders that are put around them, and all they can see is themselves. Is if all we want to expose them to is what was written in the last decade,
Mhm.
then there is this false idea of history, where I come from, how did I get here, and where
Right.
we're going, right? So,
Right.
yeah.
And they also are doing, something where rather than teaching them to, incorporate knowledge and, you know, like integrate knowledge with other knowledge and concepts, it seems like they're teaching 'em, I would call them anti-concepts, like fully formed, and then teaching them to react. So in other
Mm,
words, everything is about, reflecting or feeling or reacting to information that is prepackaged or pre-digested. Like, what do you think about the horrible things that happened here? As opposed to just this happened at this time. Let's look at how, why, when, where, who, and all of that. And then how you feel about it isn't really the goal. The goal is to understand it. The goal is to
mhm,
find the truth behind it, right? And so I think it it encourages kids to, you talk about being insular, also be very self-centered,
mm. That's
almost
a great way to put it, yeah.
narcissistic. And
Mhm,
and that's not healthy. I mean, that's not healthy for them because then, as you mentioned also, how do you have hope if you're encouraged to react to things? Because we have a tendency, especially when things are new and not always pleasant, a lot of especially history is, um, to have fear and anger be your primary, or confusion be your primary
mhm,
emotions, and hope doesn't really enter it. You have to have that historical perspective to see the cycles for 2 things. 1, the eternal vigilance that you're talking about,
mhm,
to appreciate that freedom is not given and it's not permanent and all that. You have to have that historical perspective, and to understand that it is important for you to play your individual role in maintaining it
mhm,
and safeguarding it in order to keep it.
mhm,
So that's all, like, I think with classical, children understand their connection to the human experience, not just right here in the here and now, but also the larger human experience. And I don't say that hinting that they are obligated. Don't hear me saying that because that's like a postmodern idea. But I think for their own self-interest,
mhm,
that we're empowering them, we're giving them the tool of knowledge to understand their environment and understand how to maintain their own individual liberty
mhm,
within that. Because they have the tool is your mind, right?
mhm.
That's the thing no one can take from you.
That's right. And at least giving them, so one of the arguments that, growing up, my parents always would hurl at me was, um, just give them the tools to make their own decision. Do they want to continue maintaining the same political order in which they live in, or do they want to change it? Let the children, if we give them the right tools to make that choice, do that. And how did this come about? Well, we had a friend of ours who was highly educated, went to Ivy Leagues. This is back in Honduras, and he would speak so negatively about going to college, and he would tell me, "Don't go to college. Forget about going to a university."
Right.
And now I can see many of the reasons why he would say that. But my parents' argument against that was, "Well, you've been through it,
Yep.
right? You got to do it. Allow
Yep.
him." Allow our child to do that so that he
Right.
can then make the decision and make a path for himself. Now,
Yeah. And it may or may not work out, but I guess I have an 18-year-old, and that's something I'm having to realize right now because I was concerned she wasn't, didn't know what she wants to do or whatever. And she may not, but it's not my life.
mhm,
It's a challenge that every parent faces, is to that letting go. And you want to, try to help them understand all their different options. But ultimately, even I don't know what it's going to be like. So
mhm.
hopefully it won't be too bad.
Now, so when I advise or encourage parents that we should give our children the tools that they need in order to make that decision themselves, I do that with the full confidence that they will choose what the liberty that we were given or not given, but the liberties that are protected by the political order that we currently have, or that was designed by our founders. Why? Because as soon as they're exposed to them, this is just so remarkable. Just look at me. I wasn't born here, I wasn't raised here, but as soon as I understood the principles that make the foundation of this country, I realized that I had something great here. I realized that this was, not perhaps, was the accumulation, if you will, of all of the wisdom of several hundred years, and it found itself in some miraculous way among a few men 200 and something years ago, and this is what we had as a result. So we have something great. Now, my admiration for it is not a fawning one. There's certainly some things that we need to work on. We're not a
Right.
perfect country. Uh, like Martin Luther, when he was asked, have we gotten there yet? Whereas he said, we have gone a long way, but there's still a lot of work left to be done. That is
Right.
true. There is and
Well,
will always be that way. Yes.
and the thing is people confuse perfect ideas with their execution.
Mhm.
Ideas are still executed by humans.
Yes.
And so when considering the value of an idea, you have to look at, is it is it doable? And I think the beauty of the ideas behind this country are that they are executable. Like, I mean, and look at all the crises we've been through. Look at all the fights and the Civil War and all kinds of different things.
Mhm.
And yet, even so, I mean, fingers crossed we could keep it now. But I'm just saying, for through a lot of different struggles, a Great Depression, 2 world wars, et cetera. I
Mhm.
think people forget that. And different generations with, fair to middling education and lots of immigrants coming, whatever.
Mhm.
As you say, we've still managed to preserve certain fundamental liberties, and that's saying something in the course of human history. That is really saying something. But I do wonder, how did you come to this? So you mentioned you came to classical late
Mhm.
and you didn't grow up here. But
Mhm.
when you got here and so what were your influences that made you realize what it was like? And I'm asking very intentionally because what I'm noticing in today's schools is they are not just failing to teach the principles of liberty, like,
Mhm.
at all, but they're going the other direction and teaching that they're a fraud, it's not true, it's a lie, America's a terrible place. So in other words, you know, anything that's remotely good, because it's not perfect, is being deconstructed and torn down. And I say that intentionally because they're not looking at things we all would agree are bad. Looking
Mhm.
at things that are good but not perfect, and
Yes,
holding it up like, this isn't perfect, therefore we got to throw it out. And then here comes you into a country that certainly is far from perfect in its execution, and
absolutely.
yet somehow you saw that. How did that occur?
Yes. This is good because what you're seeing is not as well. I would say it's a result of some trends inside of the classical canon. So you can see that there is this. So again, the classical canon is not this monolith that's already
Right,
set in
right,
stone, and it doesn't all agree with itself. So there's a lot of
right.
disagreement in the very classical canon itself. We see Marxist thought kind of
Mm,
flourish. So we see Karl Marx and we see several thinkers after him and also before him
true.
looking at the political. So there's this desire that we all have to reach utopia one day, and the question, at least the classical question is. Um, where are we going as a human race, and how can we improve our conditions? This has been part of the classical tradition for millennia. And what we see is that there is disagreement among all of our thinkers. Some will go one way. Our founders definitely did go one specific way. We see others going in different directions. But underlying all of that, there is a practice. There's a practice that we do a lot at classical schools because it's part of the classical spirit, and that is self criticism. Self criticism is not um, a bad thing. It's
No,
good.
true.
It's
Yeah.
good, right? To be aware of who we are, where we are, and where we're going. It's good to be aware of my thoughts and my beliefs, to weigh them, because as an academic institution that is committed to the pursuit of the truth, we're always going back to, have I made a mistake here? In
Mhm.
who knows how many steps backwards I can go in my uh, the premises that I accepted as true. Did I make a mistake along the way and I've reached a wrong conclusion? Now, that is a very classical practice. What I'm noticing is that we've taken that practice to a whole nother level where the criticism has actually become um, uh, self-destructive. It's very strange, right, to see this happening where individuals now see themselves as the problem, the color of their skin as the problem, and it's beyond self-criticism at this point. I think there's this self-abasement that's happening that
Mhm.
will be part, in many ways, will be part of the classical tradition moving forward. We don't know what it's going to look like 200 years from now. We'll be reading about this, and there will be writers and thinkers who will have insight about it, that because of us being right in the middle of it all, we're blind to. And it'll take 200 years of more thinking for people to look back on it and say, oh, this is what happened or how it happened. Anyways, I'm going on a tangent.
Okay. Okay.
But specifically,
Um,
go ahead. I was going
no,
to ask your question.
I know it's just I've never really thought about it as, Marx is part of the classical tradition because basically everything, so I see that. And certainly Marx, there are people who say, well, Marx was interrogating, class and the issues of class and power, and that's true. I guess I'm kind of stuck on,
Yeah.
look at the name of the channel, reason, right? The reason we
Yes.
learn. And so I get stuck on things where, okay, yes, he did, but at some point in his thinking process, he stopped
Mhm,
thinking and started imagining,
mhm,
and left the kind of reason, in the
mm,
dustbin, and kept on going. And it's very emotionally appealing. We, all of us like to fantasize. We, play the lottery, whatever.
mhm,
But eh, I hope that what history will do, because it hasn't worked so far.
mhm,
I mean, we've seen many examples where people have taken Marx or Marxian ideas and said, let's try to implement. He never gave us a plan for implementing it, but what if we do it this way? And it has resulted in mountains and mountains of dead bodies.
mhm,
So I would hope that the classical tradition as it evolves kind of leads with that. Because what I've noticed is a red washing of the curriculum. I mean, people talk about a
mhm,
whitewashing of the bad things. Nope. I've noticed a red washing where we have kids, college kids, even young adults, even some not so young adults, Bernie Sanders, walking around talking about how superior socialism is, or even communism would be desirable, and we cannot we're not free. Did you know us? We're not free. We need to be liberated, and the purpose
mhm,
of our education is to liberate us. Now, I don't think you would disagree that education can be liberating. Certainly
mhm,
can be a liberating force. But when I hear the postmodernists and the progressives talk about it, I don't think they're talking about the way you and I would talk about it. I think they're talking about it as though that it's literally teaching you how to be an activist because you are not currently free.
mhm, mhm,
And I that's where we depart. So I've never really heard somebody talk about it. It's like, well, Marx is part of the classical tradition. I'm like, yes, and at some point we went like this. I like to think so anyway.
Yes, yes, and so this is excellent because I was using the example earlier of that other person back in my country who would say, don't go to college. Why would you do that?" Uh, I call him my Uncle Marx for that for this very specific reason that you're pointing out.
Right.
Um, Marx, if you look at his life, Karl Marx, if you look at his life, he knew the
Do I
classics.
have to?
Yeah, there you
Okay.
go. He knew the
It's
classics.
not
He
it's not
understood.
pleasant.
he had he had studied them himself, and he had right, his ideas is kind of an outgrowth, a development of all of that which he had read and studied, and that's now how we have Karl Marx. Now
Right.
you're right to say that these influences, if you will, or these different rivers of thought that kind of spread out, They kind of get emphasized over time, and it depends on what academia is willing to focus on and not focus on. And there has been a preponderance, if you will, of attention on neo-Marxian thought, and it's
Mhm.
really infiltrated a lot of other disciplines. But you're correct. What's happening is the individuals who take on this persona or identity, they will then stop and say, we should not look back or why should we look behind all of this? Why go back to the source of all of these questions and answers? Just like my uncle Marx, who would say, don't go to college, right? Just accept what I'm telling you is true and move along with that, and then we'll reach our utopia.
Mhm.
Um, so coming from a Latin American country, Latin American countries have flirted with Marxism for a long time. So you were asking me
Uh-huh.
about, well, where do I come
I'd
from?
say they took them all the way to the dance. I think
That's
they went
right.
way past
Yes.
flirting. I don't know. But this, I think, is an interesting
Hmm.
observation. Marx gave in to the temptation to reduce the human soul's spiritual reality to a temporal, materialized state of being. I think that is an excellent observation and point to make, um, because what I see happening now is people in education, the pedagogy they're pushing
Hmm.
sounds eerily like a religion, but minus
Hmm.
redemption, minus grace, minus anything that's, really good and helpful to the human condition about religion. I mean, not that there's other things that aren't, but
Yes.
it, we're it's and it makes me wonder if one of the benefits of classical, and this, we'll talk about this a little
Hmm.
bit as we go on too, is not that there's a focus on religion, because as you pointed out, that
Hmm.
may or may not be the case in terms of how you implement it, but that you don't cut it off like, oh, we're not going to discuss the spiritual realm or the spiritual influences of the thinkers as they thought through these issues
That's right.
and where they looked for the answers, right?
Hmm.
We're not going to cut off this whole chunk of influence and information so that all of our answers have to come from the temporal and the here and now and the material. And it sounds contradictory because I'm sort of saying reason, logic, right? But if we go back in time, that you'd be hard pressed to find, including our founders, people who moved humanity forward who weren't influenced by what they thought of spiritually, what they,
Hmm.
why we're here.
Yes.
Okay. Something beyond the just, I've got to create heaven on earth, right? Right now.
Hmm.
And Marx doing that, it seems like that was a pretty big departure from what came before. I mean, am I
Absolutely. And he
right?
wasn't the first one to try that. So, several hundred years before him, we had a couple of others who were modernists, we consider modernists today, who wanted to completely cut off everything that came before them because they thought it was just rubbish. They essentially thought it was too focused on the ethereal, it was too focused on the spiritual. It dealt only with the soul of man and his heart and all these abstract ideas, but it turned a blind eye to practical things and practical living. And in many ways, they argued this is why medicine isn't advancing, this is why science is being held back. Again, the reason classical is so powerful in transforming the life of children and adults and anyone who wants to participate in this great conversation is that in a conversation you have two sides, right? You can't, if you're speaking to yourself, it's a monologue.
Mhm. Right.
There has to be a second side to everything. And
Right.
what I love about it is that they're very strong, very powerful, and I would say very convincing voices that address the Marxian problem in a way that pretty much puts the nail in the coffin, in my opinion, right? So I personally grew up in a country that is not Marxist, but there was a lot of Marxist influences, and I grew up around friends who were Marxists. So I flirted with it a little bit myself. So in my own personal path, after reading the classics, I came to the conclusion this is such a limited understanding of the human person and what the human person is capable of
Mhm.
that it really just it removes a lot of the freedoms and a lot of the experiences that I've had as a human being.
Mhm.
One of those being the divine experience. I was an atheist at the time for many years, Deb, and then I converted when I was in my mid 20s, converted in my
Mhm.
mid 20s, because I was finally open to an experience of the world that was unlike anything else I had experienced up to that point.
Mhm.
But what made that possible, right? There
Mhm.
had to be a humility that was taught to me, again, by exposure to the classics. When I realized, oh, these thoughts have already been thought and they've been done and they've been thought better than I can. That
Mhm.
is a humbling experience when you read Plato, who wrote over 2,000 years ago, and to
Mhm.
think to yourself, this man is a genius. And
Right.
why wasn't I willing to listen to him before? I couldn't understand where these tendencies, these very modern or contemporary tendencies that I had were coming from that would tell me avoid those books. Why would you read those books? They're not relevant. But when I read Plato, when I read Aristotle, when I read St. Augustine, when I read Thomas Aquinas, I mean, just a slew of authors who thought these things before I did,
Sure.
what I realized was I'm the one who's blind. I'm the one who's missing out on really understanding the world that I live in better due to pride. So that humility opened me up to wanting to experience more, to travel more, to do more, and to absorb all these things and contemplate them.
And this just happened like spontaneously. Like, I mean, you were living your life and you
Mhm.
just pick up Aristotle. Like, how did that happen? That's what I'm trying to figure out because it's not typical for somebody in their early 20s to just
Mhm.
randomly come across the classics. Was there somebody
Yes.
who inspired you? How did that happen?
So, like in my personal experience, what happened? I was getting a philosophy degree at a school where I just didn't see eye to eye with a lot of their policies, so I got expelled. So that's what happened. We moved my parents. So let me take a few steps back. So there are
Okay.
a couple of trials, and there's a little bit of suffering involved in this story. I'm going to avoid a lot of that, but my parents in Honduras realized if we want a better future for our children,
Yep.
we're going to have to move. We're going to have to figure out a way to move to America and give our children a good education. So they did huge sacrifices. They sold all their property. They did what they did for us. We moved up here, and I ended up going to a school where I just didn't feel nourished. There was something about what I was being taught that just seemed so dull, so superficial. It wasn't speaking to my heart. So I got into a lot of things that we don't have to go over, but I ultimately got expelled from that school, and I found myself in a position where I thought, what am I going to do now? My parents, they committed their entire lives to this, and I am in a place where I failed them. So
I am
there
a
was a
juvenile
school.
delinquent. No, I'm kidding.
Well, we won't go into the details.
No, 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 no. But I'm just saying, okay, you got expelled and, you know, so now that, I mean, maybe that was the best thing that ever happened to you.
It was the best thing that ever happened to me. Frankly, you're right. It was because, and now I can look back on it and say, I can see the work of a divine hand behind all of this, really moving me in the right direction. I ended up touring a liberal arts school, a small little liberal arts school in Dallas, and just falling absolutely in love with it. And something was telling me this is the place. I heard a lecture from a professor and I thought, oh my gosh, I have never heard anyone speak this way.
Yeah.
I've never been in the presence of someone who can think so deeply and at the same time can move me. So it's like this move in my soul that just inspired something that I wasn't
Mhm.
familiar with,
Right.
except when I was a child, right? There was some things in my childhood that did inspire the same movement. So I went to the the admissions office, and I said, please, I almost got on my knees and begged. I said, I've been kicked out. They don't want me at this other school. I have no money. There's no way I can afford this private, really expensive education, but I know this is the place for me.
Mhm.
2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. I have been accepted, full tuition scholarship. They even flew me out to Rome. I did a semester out in Rome as well. Changed my life forever. And on my first day of class, we read Plato's Republic. That's the first thing that
And that was it.
that was it. And I don't want to make it seem like this was an easy trek because as a Latino coming, my first language is Spanish. The way I described the next few years was I was speechless, literally speechless, because I could barely understand what people were telling me. The diction was so high in some of these texts. My classmates who had been brought up in private schools, very elite private schools, they were so loquacious. They were just talking and talking and talking about these texts. So for me, it was a humbling experience, as I pointed out. And I
Yeah.
sat there and I listened and I learned for 3 full years. I think after 3 years, I finally started talking out loud, and everyone
Yeah.
was wondering, "Whoa, where did you come from?" And but it was I was my soul was so full of some of the ideas of these texts. Some of these
Right.
texts are controversial, right? As I just pointed out earlier, Karl Marx' Communist Manifesto was one of the texts that we read. Finally, I was able to engage in these texts and dialogue with my friends and with these other thinkers. But that was a very roundabout way, Deb. I'm sorry I took you through that rabbit trail.
Okay. No, I love it because what you just illustrated is how important it is to be around people who challenge you
Yes.
and humble you and give you, a sense of perspective. And I think that's something else that our kids are missing out on.
Hmm.
We have a tendency in the current model to teach to the lowest common denominator, not to the highest. And the argument is, well, they'll feel bad, they'll feel overwhelmed, they
Hmm.
won't want to learn, they'll be, they'll just shut down and all this. And I guess I I think they're overstating it and incorrectly in certain respects. So for example, I think if you're in third, you've got third graders or fourth graders and you're cruising ahead and the kids literally cannot read. In other words, you're passing them by and not helping
Hmm.
remediate a skill. I can see that point.
Yeah.
But by the time, if you've got kids who can read and now you're in middle school or high school and you refuse to take the discussion and the reading level and so forth to a level of rigor that pushes them to
Yeah.
that's to the highest in the class. So the kids are kind of nudged, like pulled upward or
Yeah.
surrounded by these kind of more exciting ideas, more exciting conversations. I think you're actually depriving the kids of an opportunity to be inspired. And you're a classic example of that.
Mhm.
That if they had said, oh, let's slow down and make sure that Oscar understands everything, you would have missed out on a like full immersion, deep dive, like all of
Mhm.
this that really challenged you.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's true of every child, but I just think it's faulty thinking to assume that we have to go to the lowest and the kids who understand things or as you say, can talk about it,
Mhm.
they'll be fine. They'll be fine. We don't need to worry about them. I think you're actually missing an opportunity to help those who are not doing as well by
Absolutely.
get
Mhm.
hitting it a little higher. So I love that story, and it also helps understand more about how you became who you are, and how you got here.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons, Deb, I feel it as a personal attack. And again, as a classical educator, someone who's been trained classically, we're taught to really restrain our emotions, and we're very good about trying.
Hallelujah. Can we
Nevertheless, we're
get that
still
into the
human.
school, please? Okay.
We're still
How
human.
do you feel? Let's talk about how you feel. Let's spend some more time talking about your feelings. Here's a chart. Mark your feelings every single
Oh no.
day.
Yeah. So we're not taught to discount our emotions. It's very important to be aware of our
No,
emotions
I know, but
because what's beautiful also about the classical education is that our passions are eventually what are going to be used to drive a child. So think of courage, for example. The virtue of courage will drive a child to live up and stand against any attacks when the child feels like there's been an injustice done. So
right.
the emotions play a crucial role in that. But see, the
Sure.
classical educator understands how to uh, order those emotions in such a way that the child will be able to use them the appropriate way, as opposed to lashing out every time,
Right.
or having a tantrum every time the child doesn't get his or her way.
Right.
But I do feel it like a personal attack. And every time I hear educators or leaders, politicians say that the classics are not for brown and black people, it's like,
Ugh.
why? Are you saying that somehow I'm less intelligent or less able to engage in these great texts Why
Right.
are they being reserved to a limited group? Why do you just want to keep them to yourself? And I'm not far off. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was founder of the NCAA. I always get these wrong, but the acronym.
The NAACP.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you. Yes.
that's okay.
And he himself, at the end of his life, we know he was an avowed socialist, but he was a huge supporter of the classics. And then
I think Baldwin was too.
yes, yes. So
Yeah.
that's very
So
interesting. But
yeah. So I mean, people who would say that are ignoring Zora Neale Hurston too, are
that's right.
ignoring the great writers from
Absolutely.
who are black and brown, who spoke about it, wrote about it, talked about the influence. I mean, even Maya
Yes.
Angelou
Yes.
talked about
Yes.
how she didn't have books at home, so she had to go to the library, and
Exactly.
she went to the library and just read all the books. I mean, she just read what they had there, and she did not know who wrote some of the like Shakespeare sonnets and stuff. She just picked up a book of sonnets, started reading them, and she
Beautiful.
thought that it was some brown woman somewhere writing that. Like she just related so much to some of the ideas in there that was shocked to
Yeah.
find out it was this 16th century white man in England.
They found their voice. They found their voices
Yeah,
in them.
yeah,
But he writes in, I think it's chapter 6 of The Soul of Black Folk. He says, uh, "Why, O America, do you begrudge us the classics? Are
right,
you afraid that we have found the promised land?" So
right,
there is, again, we have to fight against this prevailing idea that somehow we're doing minorities a favor by
yep,
not exposing them to the classics. Uh,
nope,
to us, it actually looks the opposite. It looks like you're hiding the pearl of great price, and we're going to fight tooth and nail to get that because we have seen what it's done, not just to the Greeks and the Romans and the medieval Europeans. We've
yep,
seen what it's done to our civil rights advocates, to our civil rights leaders. It's transformed them and it's
right,
giving them the language they need to be able to continue fight for freedom. So
right.
yeah.
I couldn't agree more. That is definitely a hot button issue for me. I feel like it's the exact opposite. They're depriving
Mhm,
these children
mhm,
of just so many opportunities to engage with some of the most wonderful literature, with a full understanding of history and the
mhm.
human condition. And there's so much in that knowledge that is, like I said, liberating. Like the more
Absolutely.
you know, the more you can talk about what is real and what is true, the less likely anyone in a position of power who might want to manipulate you, control you,
Mm,
use you, etc. They, they can't do it.
yes,
They just won't be able to get away with it because you will be able to be a skeptic. Like be able
absolutely.
to like hear what they're saying and filter it through that knowledge, that process. And we're depriving kids of that and trading it for some kind of bizarre world of, as you said, like identities. And it just feels like a mystical wonderland of utopian ideals that we're going to pursue through
Mhm.
righteous indignation. We're just going to be angry enough and magically the world will appear as we want it to be. And to me, it's like teaching children to believe in Santa Claus.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just, but a very angry one. So what I do want to talk about
Mhm.
now, since we've kind of segued when you talked about how your practical experience, how you got into it, people in the audience are probably wondering, I have a lot of questions about how to get their kids involved in the classics, how to
Yeah.
get a more classical education for their children. And to that end, you mentioned at the outset, you don't have to start day one. Like, you don't have to start in
Mm,
kindergarten. You can start at any point in time. However, when they do things like, for example, go to Hillsdale, homeschool online or something where that you have a free curriculum, I
mhm.
get questions like, well, how do I transition my child from this sort of public school experience to this experience, and where do I go? Like these are the kinds of questions that I'm getting. Do you have advice for them?
Absolutely. Thank you for those questions. Just to remind our listeners, I have been running classical schools for some time now, and I've been working with children. So these are not theoretically based, these are actually practical things that I've seen work well with children over the course of many years.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I get a lot is, how is my child going to fare in a classical education school. So I ran public charter schools that were classical. If they're coming from sixth grade, they've never done any Latin, they've never read any hard books, they're not used to homework. Just a quick detail here. Most of my children coming from public schools had about 15 minutes of homework a week. That's a week. So how are they going to transition to a classical school when they're, depending on their age and grade level, they're going to be doing anywhere between 30 and an hour of homework daily, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are
Mm-hmm.
big. There's a cultural shock that the children will experience, and I want to encourage the parents not to allow that to discourage you. There will be some complaining. There will be some gnashing, grinding and gnashing of teeth. The children will not like their first few weeks of this because you're demanding something of them that they're not used to. What I've noticed, however, that over the course of at most, so the most this has ever taken is 2 months. I've seen it happen in 3 weeks. I've seen it happen in at most 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
After 2 months, our children are completely transformed. And what do I mean by that? They have picked up the habits of studying correctly. So, just to give you some anecdotal evidence, our parents would reach out to us after those few weeks and be like, I can't believe it. My child has removed all of her books and magazines from the bed. She has organized them. She asked for a desk. She has a desk in her room.
Right.
She doesn't listen to music or is on her phone or watches TV while she's reading. She's designated a space for studying where she or he can give a dedicated amount to her books, and it's incredible. And then that
Mm-hmm.
trickles into all the other areas of life, how they start organizing their life and they start to schedule things and they start to really show the maturity that we want them to see as
Right.
adults, right? So
Right.
it happens. Now, the way it happens at a public charter school that is classical is we have a program we follow. And it is, we follow it very closely and we're consistent about how do we encourage a child to continue working, and it's a gradual process. Now,
Mm-hmm.
for families who want to do this at home, I would suggest do the same thing. There are a couple of things that you should be doing to help. Number one is there has to be a designated space at home where the child studies. The child cannot be laying on bed. That's just not the right posture for it. It doesn't prepare the child to study or learn and to take seriously what they're working with. You don't have to start all out. You don't give the child hours upon hours of reading. That's just going to do the opposite. You're going to have a child who's going to be so overwhelmed and upset, and you'll just be battling with a child, and that's not healthy. So do it incrementally, and have a good program that they can follow. Give them a space. Turn off the TV when they're studying. There's all the things that distract a child. Those are the things that will make it harder for the child to be able to learn.
Right.
In terms of
So it
okay,
sounds like it still helps if you're starting when they're on the younger side
mhm.
and you can have some influence over some of these habits. I mean, I
So let's
think
let's talk about high school. High school is
yeah.
so for our students transitioning into high school, it's a little bit more. I would even say it's a little easier
Really?
because yes, because at that point, at least at the schools that I run, at that point the students are now transitioning to a more conversational format of doing class, where they go in, they sit in a Socratic circle, they have a text, and they discuss it among their friends. Now, there is no greater peer pressure
That
that
is
a
true.
high schooler can experience than to see all his or her other friends doing the same things together. That's incredible. That alone, with very little management from the teacher, will transform a high schooler, and really he or she's going to buy into this whole new way of doing things. And the
I can
tech,
attest to that. I can
yes.
attest to that because I went from public school, like through from about fourth
Mm,
grade to ninth grade. I was in Montessori before that.
yes.
And I went into a, prep school, private boarding school environment.
Mhm,
And I was an okay student. I wasn't a bad student. But when I got into an environment where, 10th grade, just like you said, we're sitting around in a circle,
mhm,
all reading the same book, and like you experienced, people are
yeah,
talking and having these conversations, and I'm thinking like, Is this going to be on the test? Like I'm coming from a totally different environment. And I wanted to be like them. Like
Mhm.
it
Yeah.
was not cool anymore to just get by and get the grade. Now you really wanted to know things. You wanted to really be this more serious student because everybody around
Mhm.
you was a more serious student. There is some power in that kind of peer pressure. But the flip side of that for the families doing this at home
Mhm.
is they may not necessarily have the benefit of that peer pressure. So they might be transitioning a child out of school and say, I want to give my child the benefit of access to the classics,
Mhm.
but I've got a kid who's been coasting and they're used to just doing the bare minimum, getting an A, and they don't see the value in being scholarly or doing any of the stuff. And now, how do I persuade them when it's just little old me? How do
Yes.
I do it?
So there are two main ways in which a lot of our families who do transition to homeschool have experienced some success with this. And the first one is the ideal one, which I know a lot of parents won't have this option to them, is uh, transition into homeschool with other families. This is so important. It's
Yeah.
very good for a young man or a young woman to have other people his or her age that are reading the same books and that provide a space for them to be able to have these conversations.
Sure.
Now, if you're not one of those lucky families and you're just so isolated, say for example, I'm out here in San Antonio, we're really we're alone, we're trying to build a community here. So I know a lot of our families are going to be in that same position. If you're one of those families, the only other way to do this is to read the books with your child. This is because what you want to do is have conversations. So
Right.
the key to make these books come alive and to make a child, a teenager want to read these more is dialogue. Have these conversations at the dinner table. Ask deep, difficult questions where their passions will be a little bit involved. Their emotions are going to be attached to certain ideas at this age. They're
Mhm.
already solidifying certain ideas. They're trying to figure out what path they're going to take, and they already have some ideas of, well, this is what I want to believe, and there's this little bit of opposition with mom and dad as well, which can be helpful. I would say use that to your advantage and have a great conversation with your child about a text that you're reading. This will
Mhm.
also help mom and dad realize how hard these texts are. So
Mhm.
instead of asking a child to read, for example, 100 cantos from Dante's Inferno in a day or two, right?
Yeah, I couldn't do that. So
Right. So, but I
it'd be a
mean,
bit much.
sometimes parents don't realize,
Yeah.
the amount. So they don't realize the rigor of some of these
Right.
poems or some of these texts. Them being a little bit involved in that could really help them decide, okay, this is just too much. We'll start
Right.
with baby steps. We'll do maybe a paragraph a day, then move on to a page, then move on to several pages, then we can do a
Mhm.
chapter. And then at that point you'll see that what happens in classical education is that the children pick that up on their own, and then at that point they've taken off. It's just a beauty to see how
Right.
a child can do that. And I've seen that a lot, both at the homeschool as well as the charter school sector. We'll have, for example, I'm thinking of a young man that I put a lot of effort into him because he was coming from the public schools. You could tell that his first prior to his first day to entering the school, he has his jeans all the way down to half his thigh. I mean, he had what he would call all his bling, and he was into what was cool at his school,
Right.
and it was a work of love to see him transform from his ninth grade all the way to his senior year, and to
Right.
see that he couldn't put a single paragraph or a sentence. He couldn't string sentences together to make a paragraph in ninth grade, and now he was giving public speeches that he had
Mhm.
written after taking my class on classical rhetoric. Now, this was
Right.
right the work of many adults and teachers,
Right.
but it was remarkable that he eventually saw, I have to take a role in this education,
Mhm.
and I need to pursue it for myself. And that's a transition that we see happen a lot in classical.
Now, as far as resources, and there's
Mhm.
a question here from Jordan. how to get a classical education for myself as an adult without full-time school schedule. Now, this I would think is
Yeah.
similar to what you want for the high school student in terms of you're in the rhetoric phase, right? I mean, if
Mhm.
you're already an adult, you're not going back to grammar. so we're
Yeah.
we're in the rhetoric phase, and you want to go start with, what would be the core curriculum that I should take a look at my own pace. Where do I find that list of books? Where do I find those
Exactly.
things I should look at?
Yes. So there are a lot of resources out there, but I would really reduce them to just a few. So Hillsdale College, the Barney Charter School Initiative, they are creating a free homeschool classical
Well, it's
curriculum.
out there. I've
It's
downloaded
already
it.
out. Okay.
So yeah, so you're suggesting that they should use the adults should go
Oh,
ahead and go to the rhetoric
oh,
phase and just
absolutely.
okay.
And this is
Okay.
why there are again these programs by the Barney Charter School Initiative are designed for both um, you know, classical schools who want to have
Right.
an orientation towards the faith, or secular
Mhm.
schools who realize, well, we're a public school, we cannot be faith oriented. Nevertheless, the the principle by which they gauge what books and what books to put in and what books to leave out is based on what does a child need to know in order to live in an American republic.
Right.
So, what are the books that have led to what we have today so we understand better where we're at and how we
Right.
got here, and then
Right.
so that we can better decide where we're going to go afterwards. So, I would
Okay.
go there. But there are other options. There's the Well Trained Mind.
That's one of
It's
my
a great
favorites
brand.
too.
It's a
I love
great
that.
brand. A lot of parents have expressed their success with it, and I know that the Well Trained Mind publishes a book that's specifically made for parents on how they can start their own path in the
Yep.
classical world.
Yep.
So I would recommend that one. There's the Circe Institute, which is another one
Yeah.
I would recommend. These
Yeah.
are websites that you can go to and start looking at the resources and just noticing how is it that they organize their own education. So I appreciate the question. In my
Yeah.
old school, the way we organized literature or the grades is in ninth grade, we do ancient literature.
Right.
In 10th grade, we do medieval literature. And keep in
Mhm.
mind that these are in line with history as well. As they're doing ancient literature, they're doing ancient history. So 11th grade, we're doing both. We're doing two things simultaneously. We're doing American history that we finish in 12th grade, but we're also doing European history, which we finish in 12th grade.
Right.
And we finish with texts such as Solzhenitsyn, 1984, where we're discussing the dangers or the perils of the Marxian worldview, if you will.
Right.
So these are very, very helpful transition to
I
get.
think it's really good to have the two be side by side because they
Mhm.
get a much better understanding.
Yes, absolutely.
So, one of the audience members, Lisa, says, "Yay for Well Trained Mind Academy." For homeschool families watching, there is an online academy called Well Trained Mind Academy, and you can
Yes.
take classes. You can take a whole program, so it's like your school, and therefore you would have fellow students. You're just not going to necessarily be physically in a building. Now,
Mhm.
how does what you do differ from I assume you've heard of classical conversations.
Yes.
That's something. Okay, so how does if people are listening and they're saying, "Oh, if I sign up for classical conversations, am I going to get similar to what Oscar does in his school?"
So classical conversations is another one that I would recommend. I realize I missed that one.
Oh,
Those
sorry.
would be my top three.
Okay.
What we do differently is we have an orientation towards the time and place in which we live, which is I live in America in the 21st century. And that's very important. Other curriculums or other charter schools or other programs, what they do is they will focus on more of the ethereal side of classical
Well, I know
education.
classical conversations is specifically religious.
Oh, and it
I
is
believe
religious,
they
right?
do,
Yes.
and they use
Mhm.
apologia for science. So
Mhm.
that's important to remember. So if you want a more secular experience,
Mhm.
then classical conversation might not be a fit
Correct.
because it definitely has a religious point of view.
Absolutely.
So that's just something that's important to mention. I don't think Well Trained Mind does. I'm pretty sure they don't. But I
Mhm.
mean, not in the academy. I don't know about in the writings. I know there's plenty of other stuff,
Yeah, I'm not
but
familiar with that. Mhm.
yeah, I don't think so. I don't think they do. I could double check on that, but that would be about the only difference. And I think that's an important point, right? That
Mm,
if you want to have a classical education, you do not specifically have to approach it from a Christian point of view. There are
mhm.
people who do, correct?
Yes.
But you don't have to.
That's right.
Right. Okay.
And so what the Hillsdale curriculum will do is that it will prepare young teenagers to be conversant in the political world that we live in today.
Right.
Whereas other classical models, they really keep it at very broad strokes. This is
Hmm.
what, the history of thought over the course of many centuries, and this is,
Right.
what every child should know and they should
Right.
pursue for their own sake. Hillsdale is a little more deliberate about let's really dive into what the American project is, how it came
Hmm.
about, what are the influences, what are some of the flaws and ways in which we can look at this and improve our situation. So
Right.
it's going to be much more involved in terms of political thought as we see it happening out
Right.
today in our own
And the
lives.
curriculum does, because I've looked at it. The curriculum has scope and sequence.
Mm-hmm.
So for you parents who are wondering, like, well, how do I do it? It's in there. It does tell you. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I understand it might be a little intimidating for people who have not been a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
but it's, as you pointed out, especially the older the children get, they're kind of running it themselves. You may sit with them if
Yeah.
you are the person having the conversations, but it's not like you're standing in the front of a room and that it doesn't work like that. And with the younger grades, more
Mhm.
of that information is given to you. So it's not difficult.
And
Um,
Deb, what's helpful about the scope and sequence, just a quick note about that, is that it has been, I mean, there's been thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours by professionals put into putting it together.
right.
And the reason is it's not just vertically aligned, where the child follows steps starting in kindergarten all the way to
Hmm.
12th grade, but it's also horizontally integrated. So whatever I'm studying and in whatever grade I'm at, so let's say fourth grade, I'm reading King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Well, in history, in art, in music, in all the other fields and subjects that the students are studying, they'll all be integrated. So they'll look at medieval art in art class. They'll listen to medieval music and learn some of the chants. So again, that's what's so beautiful about this scope and sequence is that it's
Right.
all integrated so that a child can see how knowledge is unified and how the world actually makes sense as opposed to
Right.
this atomized, randomized type of
Right.
world in which I can't make sense of it.
Right. And that's one of the reasons when you hear a child say, like, oh, why do I have to do this? It's so boring, or I don't like school. That often is the only vocabulary they have to express to you, this doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
So they might not be able to articulate, this doesn't make sense, but that's essentially what they're telling you. That to me is a sign that the child needs more sense making in what they're learning. They need to see how it's connected. And I don't necessarily mean pragmatically connected, like how I use the knowledge. A lot of people mistakenly assume that like when the kid says, well, when am I going to ever need this in life? That's another form of saying, I don't understand how things are connected. I am
Mhm.
not integrating. So they just don't have the words for that. So they say, when am I going to need this? And so what I love about classical is it does a much better job of giving them that picture, that timeline, and all of it. Let's
Mhm.
talk specifically about two things though,
Yes.
because people ask me this: do I have to do Latin?
Oh, great question. So there's a little bit of confusion regarding Latin for the reason that for a classics degree at the college level, Latin is an absolute requirement. So if you're trying to get a classics degree, again, you're going to do Latin and Greek. Now, for kinder through 12th grade, again, we're not trying to reach the level of specialization that you see at the college level. We're really giving the children a feast of different ideas, art, music, etc. Latin, I would highly recommend it because it does give you access into the very language that we speak, and it makes you a better thinker, a better writer, and it does give you access to the classics if you want to read them in their own language. Also, the same with ancient Greek. If you want to read the ancient classics in their own
Right.
language, learn Greek, but it's not a requirement. So, this is very important. I train a lot of teachers from different networks of classical schools. And what I've noticed in a lot of classical schools, and I'll explain why this is happening in a moment, but what I've noticed is that there is a tendency to want to, they're heavier on the side of rules. Are we following the rules in order to be classical at the expense of the goals or ends of a classical education? So, what in my training with teachers, what I tell them is we need to shift that. We start
Mhm.
with the principles, the end aim of a classical education and what you're trying to achieve. And
Mhm.
from there, you build out your rules that you're going to follow at your particular school.
To uphold the principles.
That's right. Because,
Again, makes
Mhm.
perfect sense
Yes,
because kids are, even pre-rational kids are pretty good,
yes,
once I mean, we're past the toddler years, right? They're pretty
yeah,
good if they're understanding at least at a high level, like, why is this rule matter? But arbitrariness drives them crazy. It
it
drives
does. It does.
adults crazy.
Mhm, absolutely. So, when a school says we're going to do Latin just for the sake of Latin, what I tell teachers is, well, you've just created a rule for yourself that might actually work against the aim or the classical principle that you're trying to achieve with your children. So, for a broader talk on what these principles are, I have some resources that I can put up on our website for our parents to look
Oh, that'd be
for.
great. Yeah.
But you want to start with the principles. And if you're in a situation where Latin is not a possibility, I would still strongly encourage that you look at other languages because it's so important for children to just, for their own edification and understanding of their own language, to be able to speak other languages or to have some familiarity with it. I'm currently using Duolingo for French, which I've been studying French for many years now, but it's so useful.
Right.
So this could
Well,
be
and
another
just
option.
even for building even for building vocabulary,
Mhm.
you know, um, my eldest took Latin and she went, I think she took 3 years of Latin and,
Yes.
in high school and, took the national Latin exam and so forth and so on. And at the time, it was very hard. It was a very challenging program, a homeschool program through something called Lukian, the Lukian Project. And, wonderful program, I highly recommend it, but super hard.
Mm.
You will really learn it and you will learn how to study too. However, as much as she kicked and screamed and when it was all done, I can't tell you how many times it's like at least every time I see her, she'll say something and she'll be like, "I know what that means." I, like it could be you watching a movie, you could be looking at something, you could be reading whatever, and she'll be like, "Good thing I took Latin. I know what that means." So it comes in handy more than people think it does. And if the child thinks at some point they might want to pursue a career in medicine or in science
Oh, absolutely.
or history, art history, these kinds of things,
Mhm.
it's invaluable. It
It
really
is.
is. I mean, I wish I'd had the opportunity to take Latin and I didn't. So I had to, as an adult studying things like history and art history, I had to go
Mhm.
back and at least familiarize myself with certain core, like root
Yeah.
words and so forth. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten as much out of, my trips to Italy to look at Renaissance art,
Yes.
for example. So, it is incredibly helpful, but you would say it's not like required. Like if for
Yes.
whatever
So,
reason.
so I want to speak a little more towards this because I know that a lot of our classical educators listening to this will probably want to pick it outside my house as as a result of my.
That's like, how did you say that it's
How could you
optional?
possibly say that about Latin?
Right.
Um, and so Latin is so important when it comes to understanding the English language itself. I mean, even the Romance languages. I mean, everyone knows that it's all connected there.
Right.
So at a classical school, it'd be rare to find one without Latin. So just want to throw that out there. Latin definitely is one of those things that you want to have.
Mhm.
If you The difference is that at a public school or charter school like mine is I can hire someone to do that. You're not
Right.
gonna find a lot of people who can do that. Now, there are some resources that make it a little easier. So now you can do Latin online. You can find a tutor online to help you and meet once a week. If you can
Right.
do that, that's what I would recommend. Find a
Right.
tutor that would help you because it's too foreign to a lot of our parents, and they're just.
There are books though. I had one when my
Mhm.
kids were real little, and there was a book, and it was geared towards the very young children.
Mhm.
And there were a few systems actually where, I didn't know Latin and yet I was kind of learning with them
Yeah,
because you had like each day you would learn, one simple concept. So you would just start very small.
yeah.
And that way you can start with kids who are in kindergarten. And
Mhm.
I'll find it and put it on my resource list. But there are tools that you can use. Then the kids get older, there's Wheelock, which is the book that a lot of
Mhm.
programs use.
Yeah.
So it can be done. And as long as you can teach your student really solid study skills,
Yes.
making flashcards, making lists, and
Yeah.
doing things like that, you can do it without knowing it. Now,
Hmm.
you will have a hard time correcting their translations. That's where you need a tutor. That's where you need to there are
Absolutely.
college kids, there are high school kids who will work part-time as tutors. So these people can be found, but I'm glad you said how important it is, because I've always hesitated to push it, um, because I don't want people to not do classical because
Hmm.
they're afraid of Latin. So I'm kind of balancing here. I want them to seriously consider it because I'm biased. But if they're saying, no, my kid won't do, I really don't want to do the Latin, so forget it, we'll find another way, then I feel sad because I don't want them to miss the rest of it,
Yes, no, I'm glad you pointed out that there are some resources all the way down to kindergarten. Classical Academic Press, for example, that we were talking about just earlier, they have a
Yeah,
program where you sing along. It's a song program where the children learn Latin through songs and singing.
right,
I mean, there's so many resources now.
right.
I would encourage our families not to
And
do
I know
this
people out there are saying it's a dead language, who cares, whatever. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so
so much.
much that is connected to
Hmm.
Latin. It really does enrich the child's understanding of pretty much every other subject they're going to learn,
Yeah,
every other
yeah.
subject. And
And
that's, of course, why we love classical, because they're all connected.
absolutely, that's true.
Yeah. All right. So let me think. What were some of the other practical things? Um, so now there will be those, and I think I saw you on Twitter the other day interacting with someone who's, because you mentioned that we have focused in this country so heavily on, skills.
Hmm.
Like, or you go to college to get a job, or you weren't, there were, and see, here's the funny part of that is we'll say that in one breath, like we focus too much on skills. And then we look at the schools like, no, no, we don't.
That's
I wish they focused a little more on skills. But
Mhm.
when kids think of going to college, or
Yeah,
even when they're in school thinking, well, I just got to get good grades to get the good grades, so I get in the college. So there's no love of learning and
yeah,
acquiring knowledge and understanding of the world. It's more like, I got to check these the boxes to get this bigger box checks to go to this next credentialing step. And then
yeah,
when I'm there, it's because of jobs, right? And you made the point that wouldn't it be great to just give our kids a love of learning, and
yeah.
somebody appeared to be criticizing you and saying, well, that's awesome, but then you have no marketable skills, and you got to go back and learn JavaScript.
Well, it's actually the opposite. You look at the research that's just coming out in the last decade, and a lot of not just colleges, but careers, and we're talking about very appealing careers, the type of careers that my parents wanted me to pursue. They're looking for young men and women who have been educated in the humanities or the liberal arts because they know how to communicate, they know how to write, they know how to think. So these are skills that you can't come to without actually reading a lot, discussing a lot in the classroom, and writing. So again, um, I'm just kind of dumbfounded, dumbfounded when
Yeah.
parents say, "Well, I want my child to learn how to type." Excuse me. And one of the things that I point out to them is, okay, let's, if this is very important to you, we could as a school have a after school club where we teach our
Right.
children typing classes.
Right.
It's not our focus, and this is
No.
why. Because 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who knows when, we might not even have any types of machine where we type on. Technology is moving so fast that by the time your child graduates college, the gadgets might be so advanced that they're probably just thinking thoughts and it's just
Right.
typing itself on a screen.
Right.
Technology changes. What doesn't
Hmm.
change is our thinking. So we
Right.
focus on how do we strengthen and perfect our rational thinking. How can I
Right.
be logical? How can I draw a conclusion that I know that I can defend? So those are the things that as a classical school we focus on. And I would say one last thing, Deb, which is this. Our focus on those things, if I can use an analogy to explain it a little better to our families, is yes, it's good to learn a vocation. Maybe I'm going to go into, say, um, carpentry. And
Hmm.
as a school, we could focus all of our attention on the tools and the trade of carpentry. But that will limit the child to just that trade.
Right.
The classical education doesn't focus on the skill itself but it doesn't disregard it. What it does, it focuses on the power that allows a child to pick up any skill. And this is the crucial difference between the two. That in a classical education, our children, after reading Aristotle and all these ancient books that people like to make fun of, they'll be able to pick up any skill without any problem. They'll be able
That's
to do
true.
whatever they want because
That's
we're
true.
working on the intellectual powers that allow for skills to even exist in the first place.
Mhm.
Whereas if we just focus on typing or carpentry, that's all we're going to get by the end of that
Mhm.
education. A
Well, they're
carpenter.
just gonna have a more full life too. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's so much we can't possibly live long enough to learn everything we would even be interested in, never mind everything.
Mm-hmm.
And, as you pointed out before about what Charlotte Mason said about the feast, it's like, why wouldn't you want
Mm-hmm.
to give your child all the opportunity in the world to learn? And then if they decide, I'd like to become the best red carpenter who ever lived, it's like,
That's right.
okay, awesome.
They
I mean,
can.
there's no specific career goal at the other end of it. You're just saying the world is your oyster now. Like,
Yeah.
go choose, because K through 12 is not supposed to be credentialing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've forgotten that. K through 12 is supposed to equip you to live life on earth, and more specifically in the United States, to live life as a citizen of
Yes.
the United States of America. I think we need to get back to that. I think we need to get back to, like, championing that, because as you point out with Hillsdale,
Mm-hmm.
what do we need to do here as citizens? We need to vote. We need to think about these issues. It's self-governance, right? We're supposed to be self-governing. We're not supposed to wait for big daddy government to tell us what
Yes.
to do.
Yes.
That is the opposite of what Americans are supposed to want. But
Mm-hmm.
if you are not well educated, if you don't understand how all the pieces move, and you can't, they can just say whatever they want and be like, okay, I guess whatever, that seems right.
Yes.
Um, then you are not actually living your best life. You're not able to protect the life that you've built for yourself, even if you've been the hardest working, greatest
Mm-hmm.
carpenter or doctor or whatever it is that you are. And somebody can come along one day and say, shut it all down because virus, and
Mm-hmm.
you might be like, okay, they said so I guess I have to. And you don't have any ability to think differently about it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you don't, because you were educated that way, that means millions of other people don't. And we know what happens then. But last question:
Go ahead.
penmanship, handwriting, cursive.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, it's very common for our classical schools to teach penmanship. Starting in the second grade, we teach our children cursive. Again, that is a what I would call a secondary attribute to classical education. It is not an absolute requirement that they know cursive, but they do need to know how to write beautifully, and their penmanship needs to be right appealing to the eye. So we focus on it for many reasons, not just because it's beautiful, it's aesthetic, but also because of the motor skills are significant for a child to be able to write in cursive and to just also teach perseverance. At that age, it's a small step, it's a small challenge for them,
Right.
and we know it's one that they can live up to. So when we give children these difficult things, we are also have an eye towards um, challenging them, but not so much where they're just going to give up, but they're going to
Right.
want to raise or come up to the challenge, and the children love it. It's the most beautiful thing to see that once you teach them cursive, that's all they want to write in is cursive.
Mhm.
And when we enter our sixth grade, so when our students transition into sixth grade, we tell them, all right, guys, you guys can choose, right? You can do cursive or however you want to write, and they just want to do cursive. They want to continue with
Well, it is faster, you're more fluid, and your ideas can make it onto the page more quickly, and you'll be a better writer. And the brain science here, anyway. But yeah, it also improves letter recognition,
Mhm.
which can help if students have a little bit of dyslexia. That can help them with that. And other things that people may not be aware of are that the student builds self-esteem.
Mhm.
So as you mentioned, giving them a little challenge that they can
Yeah.
achieve and where they can see measurable improvement very quickly.
Yes.
It's easy to see, it's visual, right? This is a big confidence boost. And at about the same time that they're really like they're really turning it up in terms of the reading, right? Second grade, going into third grade, you really need to be honing. So I
Mhm.
have something I can progress at. I see that that's going to boost my confidence in other areas. And also in terms of the letter recognition, my spelling, my reading is going to
Yeah.
improve because I'm writing. All of these are interconnected,
Yes.
and they're not separate skills, and they're not
Mm.
throwaway. It's not this like, oh, it's old fashioned. So anytime you hear somebody say, well, we don't need to do that anymore, or it's old fashioned, I don't think that should ever be a reason in
Mm-mm.
and of itself to not do
No.
something.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's so, I'm just trying to dispel some myths about classical that it's just, a bunch of fuddy duddies who want to cling to tradition or whatever. No, that's not it at all. These are time tested. There's
Mhm.
research. And as you point out, classical is ongoing. It didn't
Absolutely.
end in ancient Greece or even in Shakespearean England or whatever. It continues to this day. It's just a matter of excellent, looking for excellence, beauty, those kinds of things. And I guess there was okay. Before we finish, because I did promise that was my last question. Like I could talk to you all day, but I know I've kept you here for an hour and a half already. One of the viewers says, can we please persuade Mr. Ortiz to speak with and consult with our House Select Committee that's here in North Carolina on an education? We have this House Select Committee,
Sure.
education system for North Carolina's future, because we in North Carolina specifically want more classical education here. Probably
Wonderful.
there are other people in other states who feel the same way. Are you doing any activism, or are you doing any speaking to about school choice in this regard to get more schools like yours?
Absolutely, but it's always tied to the project that I'm working with right now, which I just want to quickly mention.
Yes, please do.
Um, I was hired by Heritage Ed, which is a group of excellent and amazing citizens in Houston who said we want classical in Houston. I love them. We've grown close to each other. We're really good friends, and everything I'm doing, whether it's talking to a different network, training other teachers, having these conversations, is really to draw attention to what we're doing in Houston. Why? Because your support, simply being aware that we exist, liking our posts, following us, that's enough to draw awareness to our project.
Right.
Second thing is what we're doing is something that you can do as well. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It is my vocation, as I mentioned it earlier. So I'm definitely available when I'm not focused on this project, which is my baby now.
Right.
I'm definitely happy to help in any way that I can to continue supporting and furthering the cause of classical education. And Deb, do we have time for a quick story?
Yes, please do.
Okay.
I'm putting a visit Heritage
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Heritage Classical Academy at
Mhm.
heritageclassicalhouston.org.
That's it. Thank you so
So
much.
yeah, support that. And then maybe we can get
HeritageClassicalHouston.org.
Heritage Classical Charlotte.
Yeah. We're also on Twitter. We're also on Facebook and YouTube. So you guys can really look
Okay.
us up and help us by drawing awareness to what we're doing.
Okay.
But I'd
Tell
be
us a
happy,
story.
and this is why. About 3 years ago, I was at a dinner where we were having a conversation, and it was a very lively conversation. Mostly everyone who was there was much younger than I was. They were in their 20s. They were just graduated college. So I was the oldest one, which is very rare for me to be the oldest one in a room sometimes. And I just listened to their conversation, and there was something that seemed very similar. I was picking up on a pattern that I had seen somewhere else. So I went home as fast as I could because I didn't want to lose that. I opened up the Torah. So at classical schools, we read the Jewish Bible. And
Interesting.
we opened up. I went to the book of Samuel, first book of Samuel, chapter 8, because I knew something that they were saying was very similar. And in it, I saw it. And what's happening at that moment is the people, the Israelites, and again, I'm not a preacher, I'm not a pastor. This is a purely scholarly interpretation of that text. The people tell Samuel, we want a king. Samuel goes and talks to God. God gives them the reasons for why a king is not the solution. And one of those is he will take your liberties, he will take your freedoms, he will take your children. But the people demand a king. And the one thing that I will never forget is They demand a king because they want someone who will fight their wars. So I'm reading that, and I looked at my wife and I said, I know what the issue is, the spirit of the age here, and why classical is so important to our American children. And it seems like our young people, their hearts, they're yearning for a king. And she was like, as an American, very proud. She said, "There's no way Americans want a king." That's, you know. And I said, "No, but listen to what's happening. They want a single voice that has the authority to squash all opposition.
Right.
That, in many ways, is some kind of king that has the power to remove anything that hurts me, anything that disagrees with me, anything that challenges me." And I
Fight
said,
my
"We need,
wars.
that's right. We need a classical education for this reason, because
Mhm.
our children need to understand that real freedom is something that they have to work towards, they have to work for, and they need to
Mhm.
prepare for. It's not
Mhm.
something that's going to be given to us." So I wanted to end with that, Deb.
That's
I'm
awesome.
so glad that you allowed me to be here today.
Oh,
And
I'm so glad that you were able to make it and that everybody was able to hear you. And this will be on replay immediately. So people who weren't able to catch it live or who joined us late will be able to see. And please do follow Heritage Classical on Twitter and also go visit the website. If you have further questions about classical education or want to look up some resources, I do have some of my locals community, the reason we learn.locals.com, and I will be adding your site and everything to that because people in Texas might want to just go there. But I can't thank you enough. And you are welcome back anytime. Anytime you have some new stories to tell us or anything,
of
please
course,
come
of
back.
course, stories.
And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
You too.
Thanks,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Thanks for coming.